buenos días, tengan todos ustedes. Agradecemos mucho de todo corazón a todas las personas que se están conectando, que están entrando a esta serie de eventos, que es el ciclo de mesas redondas en torno al Día de África. Hay que recordar que hoy es 25 de mayo, y bueno, aunque internacionalmente se celebran muchas cosas, hay muchos festejos por allí, nacionales e internacionales, el 25 de mayo se conmemora el Día de África porque ese día fue el de la fundación de la Organización de la Unidad Africana, que actualmente es de African Union, la Unión Africana, y pues ese día sirve para que muchos países pues recuerden pues todo lo que representa la historia del continente de los países africanos, la descolonización, la creación de estos organismos, y que creo que siempre es un espacio que hay que recordar. Como ustedes saben, en el Colegio de México, en el Centro de Estudios de Asia y África, tenemos desde hace años un programa de estudios de África, desde 1982, y cada año, en diversas condiciones y circunstancias, hemos participado en esta serie de eventos junto con otros organismos e instituciones, y este año pues tenemos el gusto de poder ofrecer 3 mesas redondas que yo creo que son muy interesantes todas. La primera, que es la que vamos a iniciar hoy, que es sobre el tema de cómo está la situación de los estudios de África en el mundo en términos generales, con algunos casos quizás más particulares por mencionar, y sobre todo tomando en cuenta pues que estamos en una época muy particular, que es la pandemia, que es un antes y después de muchas situaciones. Luego tendremos mañana en la tarde, a partir de las 5, una mesa que es sobre el tema del racismo y la situación académica sobre el tema de África, que también creo que será muy interesante, que va a causar, pues yo creo que bastante atención, ¿no? E interés. Y el jueves vamos a tener también otra mesa que es retomar alguna cosa ya en cuestión, digamos, a aspectos más específicos en torno a lo que es, pues, el papel que ha tenido el programa de África de maestría en todos estos años, y ver qué resultados ha habido, qué se puede mejorar, también las experiencias de egresadas y egresados de este programa, para poder ver si podemos hacer una discusión, inclusive con otros egresados, con otras personas que están de alguna forma, que han tenido algún contacto con este programa y que podrían, digamos, participar y dar sus opiniones al respecto. Pues bueno, eso sería en principio esta presentación. Y antes de darle la palabra a mi querido colega Aaron Rosenberg, que será el chair, el moderador, agradezco mucho a Jamie Monson, que está aquí con nosotros, al profesor John Chegue, a Mariana. Bueno, también saludo al profesor Jan Bosco, que es uno de los organizadores de este evento, que también es una persona que hemos trabajado muy bien y que seguiremos trabajando en este sentido. Y pues también pues agradecer toda la logística de la institución, del Colegio de México, la dirección del centro, todas las personas que colaboran en este centro, que han hecho posible este evento. Y bueno, antes de iniciar, lamentablemente sí tengo que mencionar una mala noticia para todos aquellos que en México han tenido contacto con los temas africanos, con la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores, con el mismo colegio. Lamentablemente ayer por la noche falleció el embajador Mauricio de María y Campos, quien fue embajador de México en Sudáfrica pues varios años, quien también organizaba muchos eventos, quien estuvo en el Centro de Estudios Económicos del Colegio de México. Nuestra presidenta Silvia Gorgolia, que también le agradezco, estábamos contactándonos para este tema del evento, y pues lamentablemente pues surgió esta noticia. Entonces, bueno, pues sí, pues lo lamentamos mucho, todos los que tuvimos contacto con él, todos los que lo tratamos, que tuvimos amistad, que trabajamos en muchas cosas, pues sí lamentamos esto, nuestro más sentido pésame para su familia. Y bueno, pues ni modo, la vida continúa, ¿no? Entonces, pues ahora sí damos inicio. Les agradezco nuevamente su presencia. Y ahora sí, Mwalimu Ndugu Mpendwa Aaron.
Okay, thanks Arturo. Just una notita muy rápido para los que están viendo el evento. Aunque el evento va a estar en inglés, no hay ningún problema si ustedes quieren preguntar algo en castellano o swahili o francés. o Bembe o Kikuyu, podemos recibir las preguntas de ustedes y podemos traducir sus preguntas. Las respuestas probablemente no vamos a tener tiempo para hacer esto, pero si quieren mandar preguntas en otras lenguas que son del conocimiento del grupo, no hay problema. Okay, I'm going to start off this morning with a very, very brief introduction to Professor Githiora, who spent some time here at El Colegio and has produced actually a book about Afro-Mexicans. Voy a leer su semblanza en español muy rápido. El profesor Githiora ahora está asociado con la Universidad de Kenyatta en Nairobi, Kenia. John Chege Githiora es lingüista, profesor emérito de la Escuela de Estudios Orientales y Africanos, o SOAS, de la Universidad de Londres, Reino Unido. Es egresado del Michigan State University en Estados Unidos y profesor en prestigiosas universidades del mundo, incluido el Centro de Estudios de Asia y África del Colegio de México. Es autor de numerosos artículos, capítulos y libros publicados en español, inglés, swahili y kikuyu, en los que destacan el diccionario swahili español, que todavía se utiliza en el Colegio de México, que es del año 2002. El libro que acabo de mencionar, Afro-Mexicans, Discourse of Race and Identity in the African Diaspora, que es de 2008, y Unmarked Grave, publicado en Nairobi en 2017, que es una traducción del swahili de la novela Kaburi Bilam Salaba. Y su más reciente libro es Sheng, Rise of a Kenyan Swahili Vernacular, lo cual tenemos, de hecho, una copia en la biblioteca aquí, que es de 2018, que es un profundo estudio sobre la dinámica y la multiplicidad lingüística de un dialecto urbano de Nairobi, Kenia, asociada a la estratificación social y a las identidades de los jóvenes. Karibu, Bwana Chege.
Asante sana. Para empezar, entonces.
Yeah, whatever you want.
Okay. Bueno, okay. Hubiera querido compartir en español, but as time goes on, I find that I'm a lot more fluent in English, or Swahili for that matter. And of course, we want to be able to exchange views in the best language possible. So once again, let me state my pleasure in participating in this event. Once again, very pleased to meet everyone. And again, thanks to the organizers, I suppose Arturo being one of the main organizers. And I think it's a very good idea. Right, so I'll jump into it. And I'll just start with a very broad few comments about the general ideas and state about African studies as I see it. And because I was asked to talk about both Europe and Africa, I will speak in that way. I will have to sort of talk about them separately based on my experience as well as other things. And then sort of try to bring together to see what it is that I see in African studies on both continents. Now, as I said, the field of African studies, we know has emerged in recent years from the margins to global recognition as an intellectual area of inquiry. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but the first Black Studies department was in 1968 at San Francisco State University in the USA. So again, it's a fairly... Well, now African studies, however, has grown and developed enough. It now offers academic and career opportunities in advanced studies, ranging from certificates and diplomas to the bachelor's degrees, such as those offered at SOAS and elsewhere, master's degrees, doctorate degrees, and postdoctorate work, of course, in plenty in many cases. So it's a very rich field in that dynamic as well. And I think, despite the things we shall talk about, I'm still very much a believer in the African studies. African studies also is multidisciplinary, as we know very well. And that's an important point because, as I'll try to outline very briefly later on, This multidisciplinarity provides us with very many opportunities, including those for comparative studies between other area studies with African studies. Now, but generally, the area has been engaged in research and knowledge production, teaching, and public service. So there's a lot of that among the Africanists who are spread around the world. Yet a review of the literature, as well as observation of ongoing movements in the field, suggests that many critical challenges remain. And my discussion today is largely based on online research and personal experience of 3 years at Colmex, SEA, beautiful years, 1988 to 1991, when I taught Swahili over there. 10 years at very closely associated with the African Studies Center at Michigan State. I don't know how it is, how the situation is now, but the African Studies Union at the time was very, very, very active with David Wiley in support and so on. So thereafter, 2 years at Boston University's African Studies Center, and then the big one, 20 years at SOAS in the UK, again in the African Studies Department, which sadly now no longer exists. Actually, we left together just very recently. Of course, now I'm in my 3rd year with a slight hiatus. I'm now back to Kenyatta University, where I served 2 years between 2012 or 2013 and 2015. So I have always really been in the African studies area, although my training is in linguistics. Now, I did not bother to really search more for sources, rather to try to put together my thoughts. In fact, I simply found a very interesting article by Basadou in 2019, I think it's in Africa Spectre, and who summarizes the issues that we face in African studies, I thought in a neat way, which sort of corresponds to my own thoughts. So sort of paraphrasing him a little bit, first, he identifies the problem of research in Africa being strongly dominated by outside non-African, mostly Western views. Now, that, is not, we can discuss that. That's not necessarily, bad or wrong. Well, the people involved in that are not necessarily bad or wrong, but certainly they are mainly outside Africa, non-African, and mostly Western. Of course, the theories, whether it's anthropology or linguistics or whatever it is, they're all Western-based theories. Now, the second challenge or issue is the tendency towards undifferentiated views of Africa, all right? Which usually concentrate on negative aspects, overlooking progress in many areas. So the story of, that Africa, every time the word comes up, is associated with negativity, wrong thing, poverty, disease, and so on and so forth. I was very sort of saddened recently to be asked to review and actually to provide a blurb for a book that came out very recently. And I would not bother mention the name, but these are colleagues who are based outside of Africa, out in the West. And before I could read the chapters they're in, the introduction, the words, dark Africa, sprang to my eyes. Dark. The 1980s were characterized by the darkness of Africa. Oh my God. Now, and you're talking about a 2021 book, by Africa. Well, they're Africanists because they actually work on African languages and African cultures. Yet that discourse, is just slips them. And they were shocked when I raised it. They had not seen it. They had not thought about it. It had not occurred to them. The worst part of it was that the book was already in press. It was already, the editor could do nothing about that. Anyhow, so that's an issue. Now, the third issue that I also identify with is methodologies that focus on causal identification. Methodologies that focus on causal identification are rarely used, In other words, we study problems as they are. We don't really go into explaining why and how they can be sorted out.
So that's another issue that I say. Related to that is a focus on micro perspectives, right? With very few works actually working on the bigger picture, right? For example, very specialized linguistic studies, or language documentation, of obscure languages or languages, that are very, very, unusual, rather than efforts to improve their growth and development. The science, the social scientists of this, they're more focused on simply documentation. And I'll come back in my conclusion to explain why this can be a challenge or is a problem for African studies. Now, with that broad intro, what I did and I would like to do is just, take you through, I hope I can share the slides, mainly obtained heavily relying on the Columbia University Libraries database. They have a very good website which has, they collated together African studies programs by geographical location, region, and online publications from Africa, from research centers and universities in Africa. And I thought that was very useful. So let me share this screen. Where's my screen?
John, I think if you move your cursor, there's a share screen green thing at the bottom. Okay, you got it.
So let me start with Europe. And I may have missed one or two. In case you spot that, let me know. But it's just to give a general idea of. So this is the source mainly where I sort of gleaned, gleaned this information. And so we have Portugal. Three or four, five, institutions, right? We can guess why. There are strong links, remain historical, economic, and contemporary between Portugal and Southern Africa, particularly Mozambique and Angola. And then we have Russia, of course, the Russian Academy. Sorry, we have Sweden, the Nordic Institute. Is quite active, in African studies to now. And then we go to Russia. We have 3 or so institutions, including the Russian Academy of Sciences. They have an Institute for African Studies. And then there's Sweden, and I put South Africa, University of Cape Town there incorrectly, but that's another discussion altogether. Then there's Sweden and more. Obviously, the UK has quite a few in Cambridge, Leeds, Birmingham, SOAS, and Oxford as well, right? So those are the main ones in the UK. Then Germany is also big on African studies with about 4 institutions, each one sort of specialized in one way or another. You can see one, at the same university, Humboldt, you have, a department and an institute, a degree granting department, and then a research institute. And then you have Bayreuth, of course, where we were last week, quite active, especially in Swahili and other studies. And then Leipzig, of course, and yes, I've just mentioned Bayreuth again. So beyond that, those are the, universities, basically, and centers based in universities. Now we have a few other transnational centers and associations, including Nordic Africa Institute, the AGIS, or the Africa-Europe Group for Interdisciplinary Studies, based in the Netherlands. We have a few others, the Inter-University Council for Eastern Africa. I put it there because it's also very much involved or structured around the promotion of African studies. And then we have another one in Ghana. We have the ACU in London. And we have, of course, the African Studies Associations, both the ASA UK and another one branch in Australia, and so on. So those are, it's quite, there are quite a few centers, but you can see they are concentrated on particular countries. Europe has very many countries, and to imagine that these are the only ones, Germany in particular, UK, they sort of dominate. Now, what I would like to say about this part of the African studies in Europe is I can only summarize in one way, saying that I believe right now there's some kind of epistemological crisis going on. Okay, there is a serious questioning of the nature of African studies in Europe, and across the world, let's say generally in the West. There's strong student activism in relation to that. And recently tied, actually linked, this has been linked to not just the Rose Must Fall project, but also the Black Lives Matter movement. So there is some, there is a wave of, I would just call it a wave of discontent, as we shall see from some of the comments gleaned from some of the Africanists in that. Now, again, I selected a quote and from an article by these three African students of African origin. I think they're actually African, but studying at the University College of London, which has a very prominent African Studies Center. But in this article, this is this is how they summarize it. There is no Africa in African studies. SOAS, again, just before I left, the same issue was very much alive. Where is the A? Where is the A in SOAS, right? The A was missing heavily, and eventually, as a matter of fact, in practical terms, well, as a department, as African studies, it actually is on the way to disappearance. As a matter of fact, there's no more African studies department, but we still have the masters in African studies. So their reasons were very interesting because basically, and I quote again, they feel invisible, right? And they feel invisible because they feel that people refuse to see them. They want professors to have greater empathy and listening skills, to think about their privilege. That's right. Now, we have to understand that European African scholarship is dominated by white Europeans. Now, in the United States, at least in my experience and knowledge now, there's quite a critical group of Africans, who are involved in African studies. Now, my last count, or rather my last reading of the Guardian, an article produced by the Guardian newspaper, there was less than 200 African lecturers in the UK, okay? 200 in the UK. So leave alone them, being a critical part of, let's say, the ASA UK or other stuff like that. They are spread out in very many different parts of the country and so on. So they feeling invisible, I can relate to that. The students, even though they want to engage in African studies, they feel invisible. They want professors who center Africa and diverse African voices in their research, right? And who do not see that criticism is as a personal attack. And, again, this point about solely focusing on, again, the claim was, simply focusing on peer-reviewed, highbrow, publications, leaves aside African voices very much who are not able, or many of them who do not get the chance to publish in those in some of those dailies, in those journals, and so on and so forth. So that's part of the crisis I'm talking about. And what I would like to say is that in Europe, that is a real crisis. Moving on, the problems in Europe, again, are founded on historical problems, and particularly the history of racism in Europe. And this is now what is being questioned. So among other questions is, should Africa be studied at all in Europe, or should be studied in the continent, only? These are some of the radical questions being asked by these students, right? Are the issues, because one of the complaints is that there's a lot of focus on African issues, wars, famine, economic challenges, political systems, nothing holistic about it, It's all about issues. In fact, we have several publications called African issues, right? So generally Africa is an issue, right? And that issue is what some of the Africanists have a problem with that. In Europe again, which, and particularly in the UK, but I think the rest of the Europe is not too different. Students of African descent are currently present in institutions in which they were once, not very long ago, very unwelcome or perceived to be inferior, okay? Recently, there was a serious backlash, again, at the University College of London, where a conference on eugenics was organized, and in which one of the main participants was a scholar, so-called, who has advocated for the elimination of the inferior races. We are talking of 2020 or 2019. And so students feel, who are engaged in African studies, they feel really out of place. They don't feel that they are being represented in the right way, that their professors have empathy with Africa, although they may be Africanists and so forth. So that's the side that I have. Now, moving on, back to Africa now. Let me just say a couple of things about this part of the world. Can you see it now? Can you see African studies in Africa?
Yes, we can see
okay, that. Good. Yeah, so again, I gleaned from various sources, and very, very, very few of them, right? Not too many. In Ethiopia, we have the Center of African Studies at the University of Addis Ababa. We have Ghana, the Kwame Nkrumah Institute of African Studies. Nigeria, we have a couple of them, one for African and Diaspora Studies, one for African Studies only in Ibadan. And then, of course, South Africa, Cape Town, and I threw in Dar es Salaam, Taasisi Kiswahili, because it also does have a fairly Africanist agenda, if you want, or Pan-African. So, degree programs, again, we saw in Europe, there are several places from Russia to UK to Germany where you can get a BA or BSc in African Studies, an MA in African Studies, and a PhD. Not many in Africa. Certainly, Nairobi has stopped doing that. Kenyatta University does not offer that. And these are the two main public universities who would have such programs. So we have that, we have Ghana, and so forth. Now, in my research, internet research, I went to all these universities. I went to the website and I looked at their curriculum, and I was quite impressed by the Ghanaians. All right, they have this, not only the African Studies degree entirely, they also have many languages. They teach many African languages, on their campus. And then they have this Introduction to African Studies, which says it is expected that these compulsory courses will, in combination with students' main area of study, produce students who are equipped to meet the developments of Ghana and Africa, and equip graduates of the University of Ghana to be confident, rounded scholars capable of holding their own with graduates from any part of the world. I thought it's a noble idea. And when I looked at the course, look at the sample of African Studies course, again, I was quite impressed by its structure, to help students appreciate the contemporary value of African studies, to help students engage with discourses on African realities, to encourage students to appreciate African identity, to help students develop a sense of the self-determination in the global world, to make students aware of the negative stereotype about Africa, to help students develop appropriate methodologies and frameworks for examining Africa and its past through multidisciplinary approaches, to highlight some of Africa's contributions to world civilizations and knowledge generation, something that sorely lacks in any of the European programs that I'm familiar with. And of course, to enhance students' knowledge in specific areas of African humanities and social sciences. Now, I brought this up because I think the structure of this program is, at least in my experience, it does sort of reflect a bit of what Africanists or African studies, wishes to do. Now, that is Ghana, okay? They have, University of Nairobi, no African studies. That was, I don't think it was ever began. There was Institute of Development Studies in which African studies were housed. Kenyatta University started one in 2012, and it fizzled out in less than 5 years, citing lack of funding and very crucially, lack of interest in the study of African languages from the students. Now, that's another whole issue altogether. But you can see these are the most closely related courses that I could think that address a bit of African studies there. Now, Kenyatta University seems a bit better. Can you see any of this? Is it too small? Okay. It's, let's see, yeah, that's better. They have several courses in history, okay, history department. And I highlighted some of the things that I thought, again, resonate with us Africanists, because these are the things that we would like to address more. Colonization, the colonial economy, land alienation, settler economy, something that from a non-Eurocentric perspective, the way I see it. Decolonization process, post-independent economic growth, and so on. The Atlantic slave trade. This is another course, History 201. So you can see these are undergraduate courses, very, very basic, year 1 and year 2, I guess. And then, of course, there's year 4 here, this one's here. That means within the history department, there is embedded in it quite a bit of what we refer to as African studies. And I think that's I will conclude shortly, that this is probably the direction that many African universities have taken. So you can see, now, some of them though are interesting. Theories of the state, I don't suppose that necessarily, grounded on simply African realities. It's probably more about political theory from the Western cultures. But of course, you have others like the historiography of Kenya, external written sources. So looking at texts that were written down by the early settlers, early colonists, and so on and so forth. So in summary, what I'd like to say is that European universities need to ensure their curricula deconstructs the Eurocentric format of studying Africa. That's a broad point, but that's point number 1. That Africa should not be studied through the simplistic categorizations of various African issues. There are many nuances and intersections which flow together, and they should be taken into account. African voices, alternative voices, and representation of Africans throughout the diaspora should not be the norm. Now, here we're talking about people like Walter Rodney, whose dissertation was rejected at SOAS, in the history department, because it was, whose dissertation later on turned out to be a world famous book, a book that is even now actually being read. We have the works of Cheikh Anta Diop, which have largely been ignored in Western scholarship, much of Western scholarship, at least European scholarship, I should say. I would like to focus on Europe, because I know, in my experience, American Africanists have a slightly, some of them have a much more nuanced and less tied to the history of the European colonialism. And so I think that makes a bit of a difference. And I think African studies scholars should be proactive in broadening their source to include African-based journals, conference proceedings, African newspapers, magazines and blogs, and so forth and so forth. Now, I would like to refer to a recent development just before I left, and I happened to participate in the construction, or rather in the creation and implementation of what we call professors of practice. Professors of practice and 2 other categories of global fellows and community fellows. Now, in our definition, these were public or other kind of intellectuals who do not have this formal, university, professorial qualifications, but in their own right, because of the work they have done, because of what they have produced, they were conferred the title of professor of practice. So we got people like Wangui Wagoro, and I also nominated at some, hopefully for next time, people like Abdulatif Abdallah, because these are people who have really produced important works, but because of their lack of, professional titles, they are ignored. So global fellows referred to, activists, people in music, people in all kinds of areas of work that promotes Africa, not just Africa in this case, but generally promotes the work globally and also within the community, generally within the London community. So we had people who are associated with SOAS in one way or another. They give talks there, they give, they use the library, they have library. and they can be given these privileges. So I think this is one of the kind of things that I mean by giving a bit more attention to the organic scholarship that comes out of Africa, and not just referring to the conventional peer-reviewed publications and sources. And finally, and more important in my view, that African studies generally extends knowledge production, including the training in African languages. The field, if it continues that way, it is unlikely to make significant and meaningful impact on African sustainable development, because we will simply be a laboratory for the social sciences. We'll simply be places where we go study the anthropology, the languages, the cultures, the societies, and without actually providing any kind of solutions. So that is something that we must address. And I think I'll stop there, because I'm sure there will be another moment in which we can elaborate or expand a bit more. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Chege. I think that the best thing to do would be to continue on, and people can send us their questions, and then we can engage as more of a roundtable after everyone has had a chance to present. According to this, Jamie, you're going to be the next person up. If you give me a minute, I will read your.
But I take the opportunity to say hello to Kakozi, ambaye sikuwa nimemwona. Hujambo bwana?
Jambo, nakupata kabisa 5 kwa 5. Shukrani.
Karibu sana. Tuko salama, asante. Karibu sana.
Okay, sawa.
Okay, entonces por los que están viendo la presentación, pueden mandar sus preguntas o en el chat, o yo creo que también se puede mandar al correo de seaeventos@colmex.mx, si no me equivoco, aunque yo no tengo acceso a esto. Pero con su permiso voy a leer el resumen curricular de Jamie Monson. Jamie Monson es directora del African Studies Center y profesora de historia de Michigan State University, con amplio reconocimiento en docencia e investigación. Se ha consolidado como impulsora de los estudios de desarrollo entre China y África. Su libro, Africa's Freedom Railway, How a Chinese Development Project Changed Lives and Livelihoods in Tanzania, explora la historia de la línea ferroviaria Tazara, construido en África del Este con la ayuda del gobierno chino en la década de los 70. Actualmente se encuentra trabajando en la historia de las relaciones de cooperación entre China y África del Este y en la producción de un documental sobre las historias de vida de los trabajadores de la línea ferroviaria Tazara en Tanzania, Zambia y China. Además, Monson está llevando a cabo la nueva iniciativa Global Building Trans-Regional Connections Among Africa, Asia and Latin America, que busca establecer nuevos paradigmas académicos para los estudios internacionales. Jamie, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with such distinguished colleagues and people like Professor Chege that have a long history at MSU, longer than mine. Arturo, I've known you for so long, and nimefurahi sana kuwa pamoja nanyi. Yeah, so Arturo asked me to speak about trans-regional studies, and I'll do that. And I wanted to start by giving a bit of an overview from African studies and taking somewhat of an institutional perspective as director of a center, hopefully not too administrative, but kind of challenging institutions to be able to transform along some of the lines that we've just heard in responding to real challenges of failure to decolonize the way we produce knowledge, and failures really to open up space for African participation in the production of knowledge of their own continent. So I've prepared a little PowerPoint just to help guide my comments, and then hope that we can use this for a broader discussion. So let's see, I don't know if I can, well, I'll just, if I can go to this, will that work? There we go. Okay, so as I said, I wanted to talk about transregional African studies, and I'd like to locate these comments first in the context of African studies, and really the kind of ongoing and perpetual crises in African studies that we just heard about. And I wanted to start by just looking at this long trajectory in the African Studies Association of presidential speeches, or the presidential address referring to this crisis, going back long before probably Paul Zeleza, but I thought he's done a lot of writing about the challenges of African studies. And really, he argued that the perpetual crisis was precisely because these questions of decolonizing, of opening up spaces from what Sandra Green called the gatekeeping of Africanists from the global North, that this was creating these unyielding solitudes, and especially he was referring to the creation of departments of Black studies and Africana studies that just felt that African studies programs were not making a space for them either in terms of their identities, but more importantly, ways of working with and understanding Africa and the African diaspora. So that was one of the solitudes, was the kind of the gap between Black studies and African studies, but also just as significant, probably more significant, the gap between African understandings of the study of Africa and what was happening in universities of the North. Sandra Green in 1998, just a year later, articulated many of the same concerns. And then we've just had this very influential and strong intervention by Jean Allman in her presidential speech, which has been published in the African Studies Review and provoked some subsequent panels and dialogues in the ASA, including the renaming of the Herskovits Book Prize, that she documented the ways that it had privileged white authors, especially white male authors. And so she argued that, using some of the language that we've just heard, that it was time for Herskovits to fall. And I want to flag some other intellectuals that have written very beautifully, I think, and provocatively, especially William Martin and Michael West. These are not, in fact, Jean Allman based much of her speech on some of their concepts. What they were really pointing to is the way that African studies, which has a long history going back to the 19th century of the study of Africa, even emerging out of diasporic African knowledge productions, that African studies was sort of displaced or overlaid with what was, after the Cold War, area studies. And so I think the conflation of African studies and area studies has been part of the challenge, because, as we all know, area studies emerges after the Cold War as a very much Western and especially US centric strategic project of knowing the world for, and we have this in our national funding mandate, some of them, knowing the world for strategic purposes, that African languages need to be known so that we can engage in whatever diplomatic, security, developmentalist paradigms we may bring to the field. And so I think one of the questions is, can African studies, or the production and dissemination of knowledge about Africa, be productively separated? And Martin and West were hopeful that following the Cold War, that there would be a dissolution of the sort of African studies strategic focus that would open space for what they called a return to the past, a return to a much more diverse, much more diasporic, much more robust and rigorous and engaged and just and transparent. I mean, all those good words. They had a kind of optimism about where African studies might go, including the possibility that African studies could productively be kind of recentered in Africa. But I think as Jean Allman's talk and many of the subsequent roundtables at the ASA demonstrated, this has not happened. And so, but I do want to acknowledge the momentum, and I think the focus on young people and youth is important. I think that that young people are really pushing institutions to make these connections. What Paul Zaleza called multiple Africas of the global diaspora are becoming more connected and robust. For example, the African Studies in Africa Association. So I think there has been some movement, some positive movement in these directions. And I have long argued that that the African studies of the future really needs to be a global African studies centered in Africa, but one that can also build productive partnerships among many global institutions. We have very strong African studies programs. I mean, in Mexico, obviously, what's bringing us here today, in Asia, different parts of Latin America, North America, the Middle East, and the Caribbean. And I believe that in addition to having marginalized African scholarship, the US-centric nature of the African Studies Association has long marginalized and even made invisible very critical scholarship from diverse epistemological and theoretical perspectives from other parts of the world, especially places that have diasporic and Africana populations, for example, in the Caribbean. And I've had a tough time as a director. I just have to tell you personally, Emily Riley is one of the people who's heard me talk about this, but you know, we have an association of African studies programs, and Emily is our very hardworking and dedicated secretary. The acronym is AASP, Association of African Studies Programs, but it is really only, has only been until at least recently, and I think Emily's helping too, American. So there was just a conflation of American African Studies programs with African studies. There was just a sort of underlying assumption that African studies was an American endeavor. I think even working with European Africanists is something not many Americans have actually done much, with the exception of maybe a few big programs in the UK or Leiden, for example. And so I've been arguing that either the AAASP has to rename itself the Association of American African Studies Programs, or be more inclusive and meet on different continents, or do something to acknowledge that it's a bigger field than just the center being the United States. So let me turn from my comments and kind of critique of where I see African studies today, and what is transregional studies. Obviously, this is a new, maybe not so new in some ways, because the whole history of diasporic African studies is a transregional endeavor. And I think diasporic mobilities and histories are one of the most important areas that transregional studies has really helped to illuminate. I mean, just look at the history of the Atlantic world. And actually here, of course, at MSU, we have a very strong Atlantic world program that is very global. So I think we at MSU probably have perhaps more of this than some other institutions, but transregional studies is an idea that's been around for some time, but those of us that work across regional boundaries, for example, my work in China and in Africa, have been dedicating some time to thinking through what this really means and how it might be another way of imagining the way we study the world. So the area studies paradigm, as we all know, was you have an international studies center like ours, and then you have a center for Latin America, a center for Africa, a center for Asia. And quite often area studies did not include the global north, although in our center, our institute, we do have a Center for European Studies. So transregional studies, first of all, is one way to move beyond these silos, these boundaries, like, oh, you can only, locate your research in one world area. And Professor Chege, I think with his work on Afro-Mexico and his whole globally engaged career is an example of someone who's just done this. Even I think the book shown, just crossing these boundaries of language and the way just studying African languages as if there weren't influences across languages and cultures is something that transregional studies investigates. And so what transregional studies allows for is collaborations across regional expertise. So not just interdisciplinary work, and almost all transregional work that I'm aware of is interdisciplinary, in addition to being an investigation of those phenomena that cross boundaries. As I said, I think diasporas are a really important component of that, mobilities, migration, and so on. And one of the organizations globally that's been most influential in thinking through what this means is the Social Science Research Council, or the SSRC, especially Ron Casimir, who is an Africanist there. But SSRC also has a very big and very influential program on the transregional Indian Ocean and on what they call transregional Asia, a really amazing, provocative program. In my experience, these transregional initiatives from the SSRC, if you want to look on their website, really innovate in ways that take us away from some of our conventional ways of thinking about understanding the world. And so this is a quote from the Social Science Research Council, that the study of globality requires an understanding of connection that's critically informed by place-based experience. So the premise is that regional studies, or let's say African studies, are actually strengthened and made more meaningful when the connections among regions are acknowledged and used as a frame, not the only frame, but that they can reveal things that we may not have understood in other ways. So this is going against another binary that was popular about 10 years ago, which was that area studies should just go away. The Cold War's over. Everything is global, globalization, the world is flat, whatever you want to, there was this move from area studies to global studies, and transregional studies is a rejection of global studies, because in our opinion, global studies erases this critical place-based experience. And I think it gets to what Professor Chege was also mentioning, that we don't want to just be some micro, that we don't see these bigger contexts and bigger engagements. So the premise of transregional is not that we go global and forget the local, but that we understand the global in a way through place-based experience. But these are just some other ideas from the Social Science Research Council, that global research institutions are strong and vibrant. So I think the old model of African studies presumed that knowledge should be in the Western institutions because those were the strong institutions. That is certainly not the case at all. That we live in an increasingly multipolar world. I don't know as a historian if we would say there was never a multipolar world, but it's something that people are more attuned to. And also just to remember the importance of cross-disciplinary work. And again, this is really, a lot of this grew out of conversations that we've been having with Ron Casimir, that we need to produce knowledge together among global partners. So for example, my field of understanding the relationship between Africa and China, so often Western scholars just look at Africa and China as the objects of study. Oh, those are the actors that we will study as the Western or Northern scholars, rather than studying with African colleagues or studying with, and hopefully studying with African and Chinese scholars to create research that integrates different perspectives. So even in Africa, China, we just get a lot of Western dominated approaches, many of them motivated by discourses that emerge out of strategic interests, and connecting with each other across global axes. And the idea is to strengthen both global and area studies. And I think we kind of throw that in there so that institutions don't panic about too many changes. But these are some of the critical questions. We have had a couple of very important symposia about this, and Arturo Saveda was one of our participants who just added a great deal. So some people have challenged this model and said, if we just do transregional studies, will we just leave area studies sort of untransformed? And will this reduce the possibilities that area studies will have to undergo that very critical kind of interrogation and self-criticism that is being put forward right now? But the other thing that's really important here, people say, you know, is transregional studies the study of these connections in the global South? So is it the same as South-South studies or theory from the South? If it excludes the global North, again, how will institutions be transformed? If we don't engage, what are some of the consequences? So these are some critical questions that have arisen. And then some of the challenges that I think are quite provocative are methodologies. When people do transregional work or collaborative work across regions, you know, I've been learning Chinese about almost 15 years. I would never call myself a China expert, but what are the strategies that people have to develop when they work in this kind of way? Institutional rigidity. Institutions don't want to change. My department is one, my history department. All of our graduate students have to pick a region. They have to pick a region of Africa because that's how people get jobs. And we want our students to go out and get jobs. So they have to be a South Africa or Southern Africa specialist or Eastern Africa, for example. Publishing and dissemination often are linked to area studies. You know, people have an African studies series, although that's starting to change now. And funding, but we have found that funding agencies can be way ahead of others and actually push the field in sometimes generative ways, especially organizations like SSRC that develop a lot of concept notes. They do this as well. And I think I'll just stop here and leave the rest for questions. Another quote, that area studies without global studies are blind, and global studies without area studies are empty. So I'll stop there. I had a few more thoughts about China, Africa, but I think I'll save those for the question and answer period.
Okay, thanks very much, Jamie. We do have some questions that are showing up in the chat. As I said, I would like to sort of plow ahead through the presentations, and then we'll have time after the presentations to take a look at those questions. But we do have some questions which are showing up in the chats. Okay, our next presenter is Mariana Candido. And once again, I will briefly read her curriculum. Mariana Candido es historiadora egresado de York University, Canadá, y del Centro de Estudios de Asia y África del Colegio de México. Es profesora asociada de historia en Emory University en Estados Unidos. Sus investigaciones giran en torno a la historia de la parte occidental de África Central en temas de migración, identidades, de esclavitud y género entre los siglos XVI y XIX. Ha publicado numerosos materiales académicos, entre los que destacan Fronteras de esclavización, esclavitud, comercio e identidad en Benguela, entre 1780 y 1850, del año 2011, y An African Slaving Port and the Atlantic World, Benguela and its Hinterland from 2013. Uno de los, de 2013, perdón. Uno de los finalistas del premio Melville Herskovits Award para el mejor libro en estudios africanos. Actualmente, Candido es miembro del comité editor de African Economic History y de History in Africa, además de ser uno de los editores de la Enciclopedia of Slavery, Slave Trade and the Diaspora in African History. Bienvenida, Mariana.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction. And I also want to thank Arturo Saveda for inviting me to join this roundtable today. And BCEA, which is where I did my master's many years ago, for hosting this event and allowing me to be in Mexico, even if from far away from Atlanta. So thank you. So when Mwalimu Saveda asked me to join this roundtable today to think about African studies in the world, the challenges and achievements, it forces me to rethink about African studies and engage with some of the questions that the previous speakers already presented and raised. So what I want to discuss today is the role of African studies as a space to rethink knowledge production and the struggle that comes with the baggage of African studies. I also think it's important to recognize that there is a history in the creation of African studies, that it's based on excluding colonized people in SEA, the creation of African studies in El Colegio de Mexico in 1980s create new possibilities. So I want to exchange some ideas about that. And also possibilities of what it's possible to do with how African studies can help us to understand our societies nowadays. So as the previous speakers have already mentioned, there is a long history to African studies. And by the time it was established, it was created as an area of studies in the 1950s in the United States and in Europe. It is a context of the colonization, the emergence of new states, but it's also the context of Cold War. It's also this moment of the United States trying to expand and consolidate its power as a global empire and trying to replace European empires in the international sphere. So I think it's important to understand that as well, that there is, thinking about colonialism is central to African studies. And the African studies do not emerge from empty spaces. In universities in Europe, there have been a long tradition of studying colonized people, studying the language of colonized people to better control them. Before the First World War, there was a great admiration in Britain and in France for the schools, the colonial schools established in Germany to better administer German colonies in Africa. So it's quite violent, the process of establishing African studies in Europe and later on in the US, because it's based on the experiments that Nazi Germany was implemented in its colonies, in its African colonies. Let's not forget that the British and French political elites admired the so-called scientific studies that were carried out on the Herero and the Nama people in German Southwest Africa. So African studies is connected to colonialism, better control colonized people, and also with the murder and the genocide of the Herero and the Nama people, but also many other African actors who were constantly excluded from African studies in the past and in the present. So I think it's important to understand also how this African studies was established and what we are fighting against in this moment, what we are trying to disrupt when we think about the future of African studies. So the model of African studies programs that the French, the British, and later on American scholars model the way they think about Africa was very much inspired by colonialism and these efforts to classify, to understand, and to control people. So there is this very strong ideology of white supremacy that it very much informed African studies. And I wish we had been aware, that I could say that we have moved far away from that, but I don't think we are at this point. If we continue to emulate practices, to use languages, to publish books that, as my predecessors mentioned earlier, treat African societies as problems that need to be solved. Current crises are seen only as current crises rather than historical problems created in a specific context. So I think we have a long way to go when we think about the African studies and the challenge that we have in front of us, in part because much of the knowledge that we have about African populations were created by colonial officers who wrote these treatises on customs, on jurisprudence, on religion, on history that we continue to use, we continue to read, we continue to cite, and not necessarily cite or use these studies to problematize how this knowledge was created, but we use as a source of information, not decolonizing these sources. And we have a long way to go to decolonize African studies. In many ways, by the time African studies were established in Europe, in the United States, and including in Mexico, decolonization had very different meanings to Americans, to Europeans, to Mexicans, to Latin Americans, and to African scholars and academic institutions. So I also don't think we are talking about the same thing when we use the language of decolonization. What decolonization might mean to someone in Angola is very different from a South African or for a Brazilian scholar like myself. So we are using the same words, but not necessarily for the same purpose or with the same goal. And central to African studies is the idea that scholars from the global north are the better equipped interlocutors to observe, to analyze, to understand colonized people around the world, a logic that remains very much alive in universities in Europe, in North America, that privilege European languages as languages of proper academic production, the privileged publication in European and North American based journals as a proof of intellectual engagement, but also the fact that we are using English to discuss today. I think it also reveals how we think about knowledge exchange and knowledge production around the world. And in many ways, I think that many very well-intentioned scholars do not expect African-based scholars to identify and solve their own problems. There's always this idea that people from abroad, from Europe, from North America will come to understand the problems. And this has been pointed out by several Africanists, but in many ways, we identify these issues and we continue to perpetuate these inequalities. And we continue to act as gatekeepers, preventing African-born and African-based scholars from publishing and voicing their own expertise. And I hope we will have a chance to talk further about this. I am in a journal. I am one of the editors of the African Economic History. And it's quite astonishing how African-based scholars are constantly rejected by peer-reviewed scholars in the process of peer review because their work don't engage with scholarship produced in the global north, which ironically, they might not have access because of the fees associated with downloading articles or buying books published in Europe and in North America. But I want to move forward in thinking about how the creation, and I will not talk much about that because I imagine that Arturo will talk more about the SEA later on. But the possibilities that the SEA create for Latin American scholars like myself as a space to rethink and create new solidarity opportunities and new intellectual exchanges for scholars in the global South. The opening of the SEA, the Centro de Estudios in the Asia África in el Colegio de México represented a rupture to this model of the global north knowledge produced about Africa, but one that also perpetuates dependency, extractivist practices, and logics of empire. Colmex, for much of Latin American scholars, is a space as an alternative, almost as an antidote to the idea that African studies is a space of white knowledge on non-white people. And I also believe that SEA was an effort to move away from teleological views that imagine colonialism as inevitable. The creation of the SEA in el Colegio de México offer the possibility of recalibrate a scholarship that imagine progress as preordained in the notion that European and their descendants as the natural agents of progress around the world. One of the things that Colegio de México offer was a new intellectual dynamic where Latin American scholars interacted with African and Asian-born scholars, and together they consider new epistemologies and new ways to imagine research and collaboration. One point that I think is important to express about the Colegio de México, at least by the time I was there, is that it not only hired African-born and African-trained scholars, but it to teach languages, but it also included African intellectuals to teach economy, literature, and history. African scholars were not only valued for their language skills, but also by the discipline expertise. So in many ways, the Colegio de México created a space in the global South to recognize African expertise in political science, in economy, in history, and also an opportunity for Latin American scholars and Latin American students to see African scholars like ourselves, like Latin Americans, people on our own feet struggling to overcome a series of problems, such as IMF structural adjustment that destroy our universities, but also the fact that North America, the United States, and European governments constantly turn a blind eye to undemocratic regimes that insist in silencing intellectuals in the global South. So in many ways, for Latin Americans and the Colegio de México offer this opportunity to engage with scholars in the global South in a different way, that it was not a way of us being observed and studied, but it was as in dialogue with fellow colleagues in the global South. We also share the experience of citizens of colonial states created to perpetuate white supremacy ideologies and values. And in many ways, we share the struggle to have our research recognized as valuable. And we are constantly told that we have to produce, present, and publish in English. Otherwise, we do not exist for the global community, when the global community really means people in the global north. So El Colegio de México and the program in African Studies share this commitment to express and engage in new epistemologies the challenge of racist science informed by Enlightenment, colonialism, genocide of Native American populations, slave trade and slavery, and dispossession of colonized people around the world. So for me, as a person born in Brazil, was a thrilling experience to be in Mexico and engage in these conversations. And not only me, talking with people who also went to Mexico, we all recognize how at SEA, in the creation of African studies at SEA, created the academic environment for Latin American scholars to learn and exchange ideas with African intellectuals and see each other's humanity that in many ways are things that we are constantly denied when we interact with scholars from the global north. So African studies has a long intellectual and difficult history, and where scholars from the global south are constantly marginalized. But I do believe that it is an exciting space to discuss and understand our own societies and alternative views for our future. For example, I think that learning about Africa, learning about African societies can offer us new insights about current immigration issues that we face in North America. And now I change and I focus on where I am right now in the US and how we can learn from Africa if we think about immigration, asylum laws, and guest worker programs, and how they are related with European colonialism in Africa. When we think about immigration laws, I think I find it very exciting to discuss apartheid South Africa, not because talking about apartheid South Africa is exciting, but it's to push students in 2021, American students or students who are attending an American university in 2021, to see the parallels between apartheid past law in South Africa and the policies that continue to regulate who can move and who cannot move between the global south and the global north. There are lots of similarities about between guest work programs in the United States and the same kind of colonial regimes that try to police the movement of Black bodies in Africa. So we have African studies is very useful to understand the present, our current present and our current inequalities. The same is true when we talk about subsidies that farmers in Europe and North America continue to enjoy in the name of free market, in itself an ideology created in the context of imperialism. So I also find it very exciting to teach and talk about, for example, policies implemented by the British or by the French or by the Portuguese to protect white settlers from Black competition in Kenya, in Gold Coast, in São Tomé, or in Angola, and draw parallels with current economic policies that continue to protect the interests of farmers in North America and Europe, and compare them with the colonial policies implemented to protect the interests of settler populations in South Africa, in Kenya, and Angola. Also talking about oil and mining companies nowadays and how they operate in the same logic of colonial dominance that provided very little for extracting natural resources. And so it's very easy to look at 2021 and see how 19th century ideology continue to inform the decisions of financial institutions in the West. And let's not forget that the COVID crisis revealed how colonial logics continue to dominate government policies in the global north, but also the distribution of resources and vaccines. And now in the United States, we are all we have access to the vaccines and we could all be vaccinated if people wanted to be vaccinated. Why my family in Brazil don't have access to vaccine. My friends in Brazil don't have access to vaccines. And the same is true for many people in the global south. But in many ways, the COVID crisis also revealed how how colonialism also exists within North America, within the United States and in Europe, where populations that continue to be excluded from running water, access to power and internet, but also medical care. So in many ways, they are colonized populations within the United States and European countries that are also excluded from rights. So African studies is relevant. And although we have many challenges, looking at African societies in the past and in the present also help us to problematize the United States, Europe, inequalities that existed in Latin America, within Africa, but also to think on how we reproduces the logics of colonialism, how knowledge is created, how exclusions are perpetuated, and how all of us participate, benefit, or are simply complicit with this logic of empires that are very much alive in 2021. So African studies should be a space in the academic world where we question who we read, who we cite, who we recognize as authorities in a specific subject. It should be the space to embrace and engage with the ideas of Black intellectuals, Black feminists, and look for alternatives in the academic world. I do believe that African studies, despite the funding crisis that we face, can be a tool of liberation as a space where global South scholars can imagine alternative futures that challenge empire building and the dispossession logics that continue to commodify knowledge and how we interact with the past. So there is a long road ahead of us, but as the freedom fighters in Mozambique, in Guinea-Bissau, and Angola expressed more than 40 years ago, a luta continua, so it's not over. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mariana. As you all can see, there are other questions showing up in the chat. So when you have a minute, I might take a quick look at those so we can consider those when we're done. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Arturo Saveda, who probably needs no introduction, but in any case, I will read his bio. José Arturo Saavedra Casco nació en la Ciudad de México, historiador con licenciatura en la UAM Iztapalapa y maestría en el programa de África del Centro de Estudios de Asia y África del Colegio de México. Tiene un doctorado en Historia Africana y Literatura Swahili en la Escuela de Estudios Orientales y Africanos, SOAS, de la Universidad de Londres, en el Reino Unido. Ha publicado varios artículos y libros en América Latina, Europa, Estados Unidos y Tanzania. Perdón, sobre historiografía, historia africana y poesía swahili como fuente histórica. Es profesor de lengua y cultura swahili, Islam en África, historia e historiografía africanas en varias prestigiosas universidades mexicanas desde 1993. Ha impartido seminarios en SOAS, en el Instituto de Investigación Swahili de la Universidad de Dar es Salaam y en otras instituciones académicas de México y los Estados Unidos. Actualmente es profesor investigador de tiempo completo del área de África del Centro de Estudios de Asia y África en el Colegio de México. Karibu, Arturo.
Asante sana, Aaron. Bueno, pues otra vez, muchas gracias a todos por permanecer en este espacio. Sorry, I forgot that it's in English. I switch off to into English. Okay, well, my presentation is about 3 points of a topic that has to do with the state of the specific case of Mexico, but also I will make some mentions in some parts of my presentation comparing with other Latin American countries that I know a little bit better, but is mainly focused in the case of Mexico. Also, probably I will make some comments comparing the situation that has already mentioned my colleagues Chege, Jamie, and Mariana, concerning what it will be the coincidence and the differences, but above all, the similarities that we have as obstacles for spreading and making, how can I say, much broader the scope of the African studies in our academic spaces. Okay, so the 3 points that I will focus, it will be first, the historical background that we can find in Mexico and Latin America, in which the cultural, the intellectual environment limits or has limits the spreads and the importance of this kind of studies. The other is something that is important, specifically if we compare it with the situation of other countries like European countries or United States, in which the study of areas, specific areas, has to do with national security, with more important economical and strategic interests. And in the case of Mexico, the foreign affairs policy is not favorable to spread or to motivate more studies or more approaches in Africa. One is more specifically, and it will be the final point of my presentation, it will be the current state of the African studies in the Mexican context, okay? Well, so I will share a little bit on a PowerPoint that I have already in my screen. So let me check. Okay. Okay. So the first point, the historical heritage. Okay. Well, as we know, in the case of Latin America, the main contact, the main cultural and historical contact with Africa is because of the colonial Spanish and Portuguese presence, because unfortunately of the infamous slavery trade. In that sense, okay, the point is that the differences that we can find among several Latin American countries and the case of Mexico is the grade of identity or background in a cultural heritage that is recognized by the people, okay? So if we compare it with countries like Brazil, like Cuba probably, in which the African presence and cultural environment is stronger, in certain sense, we can understand that this past, the past that that these countries have, can help to introduce a more academical approach to the African context. I mean, because this idea that there's a closeness, that there's influence in many fields, cultural, in matters of, how can I say, or food or customs, even social practices. In that sense, it's much easier to think that there are a justification to think more about Africa in several contexts or spaces. But in that case, the problem with the Mexican identity, if we compare it, is that if we explore the history of this country, the problem is that we share also this colonial past of slavery. But the point is that at the end, the idea that is developed specifically in the official history is that the African element was not strong. I mean, it's something that people who are involved or found in Afro-Mexican studies know very well. That idea that how can I say, the original idea is to say that we don't have a lot of contacts, no? That is, there were not many slaves. Even there are some historians, I remember one that it was a very, how can I say, the important historian, for example, Enriquez Flores Cano is not the one that in some work said, no, there were not many and they're mixed with the population. That's why we don't have any presence or identity. But it's not true. I mean, we have proof, specifically in the last 30 years, all these people who are working in seminars and spaces, that this is stronger, that presence, that influence, even linguistically, culturally, in the music, etc., etc. But the point is that the official history and the official identity that was created due to this connection with the official history is that Mexico is a mestizo country. One important author and intellectual that has to do with this is Jose Vasconcelos, the founder of the modern National University, with the idea of the raza cósmica, the cosmic race. That idea that Mexico, like other Latin American countries, are formed by the influence of Europe and the indigenous originary people, obviously in a very idealized and philosophical approach. But in that sense, specifically, Gonzalo Aguirre Beltran, you know, he was one of the persons who analyzed or who began to analyze that context. The idea, specifically in the first half of the 20th century, was to say that Mexico is only a mestizo culture, no, European and indigenous, and that Africa heritage or influence is non-existent. That idea, as we will see, is not helpful to justify or to promote African interests or African studies in general. I mean, is this the context? So, unfortunately, in the last years, because there had been a very important, how can I say, development of the Afro-Mexican studies, even we must remember that our friend Chege, even that he's Swahilist, and I am identifying as a Swahili scholar, he produced also scholarship and he made an important research about Afro-Mexicans. And now currently there are more people working on that, even Mexico and outside Mexico. I mean, the scholarship is increasing. I mean, we cannot say that we are in the same situation but of the time of Aguirre Beltran, when he exposed the problem. But in that sense as well, it's also true that politically and socially and culturally, there are more organizations, more people interested specifically in the areas of the Costa Chica, of Oaxaca, and Veracruz, who they're very conscious of the importance of insist in the recognition of this African element or historical heritage. No, that's something that is very important to take in consideration. Probably something that is important to improve more, but probably is not my topic, but I want to mention, is that normally the topic of the Afro-Mexican heritage is focused on the colonial times and slavery. And we can also see that in other moments of Mexican history, specifically in the 19th century, there was a limited migration of African people from Sudan when it was the French intervention in the 19th century. And also, I was shared recently research of some people working in the, I think it's the University of Southern California, I'm not sure, that is about a very important amount of slaves who run away from the southern state of Texas before the Civil War, that they took, how can I say it, a haven in Mexico of that time, because the Mexico of that time of the 19th century already have abolished slavery. And there's the story of families or people, slaves that run away from Texas, that they thought that it was much easier to reach the Mexican territory than going to the North States. And it's very interesting to rescue that the contact with African and ex-slaves is not only the colonial times. I am sure that the scholars, even my friend Maria Lisa knows that. Actually, we have talked about that before, that she has contributed with those newspaper views. And it's interesting because this academical and even the action of the groups of Guerrero and Oaxaca that are making efforts to change the constitution, something that has been made partially and probably not satisfactorily about the rights of Afro-Mexicans of the political and social recognition, and also a reconsideration of Mexican history. For example, there's one famous historical character, Vicente Guerrero. At the beginning, before these changes, it was considered a mestizo or mulatto. Now it's considered Afro-Mexican, and there are small details, but I think in that case, is positive these changes that probably are subtle, but in my humble opinion, I think is a step forward, no? But the historical heritage up to the recent years has not been helpful. The other point, the diplomatic amnesia, is something that when I can lecture in other universities and in other spaces outside the Centro de Estudios de Africa, because our program is more focused in more specialized things about Africa. But when I took the reason why in universities is something that I will reach later, there's some few space about the African topics, or probably they're not, and actually in many cases they're not existing. Because in the case of the foreign relations, Africa is an area that is not taken in consideration from a long time. I'm not inventing anything. I mean, that's the positive thing of the spaces like here, that we have the freedom to express our ideas with proofs, with elements. But the point is that historically, only specialized people know that actually the relations with African countries is not so new. The most important episode that most of you know is one in 1936. The president of Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas, by then the president of Mexico, protested by the Italian fascist invasion of Ethiopia in 1936. Actually, it was the one country outside some circles of the United States, the how can I say, the Pan-Africanist and African activists of the time, that protested internationally of this invasion to the League of Nations of that time, the antecedent of the United Nations. So since that moment, the relations with Ethiopia and Mexico existed. After the Second World War, in 1947, Ethiopia got relations with Mexico. Actually, the Emperor Selassie visited Mexico in 1954. That's the reason why we have a tube station and metro station of the name Ethiopia. That's the reason. And in that sense, there's a background. There's an, how can I say, there's certain previous contact and diplomatic situation with the African countries. But interestingly, the second moment in which Mexico has more relation with African countries is in the presidency of Luis Echeverría Álvarez, a president that has a very, how can I say, closed involvement in the non-alignment movement. And by that time, there was a lot of contact with African countries. It is necessary to remember that he created an institution called the Centro de Estudios Políticos y Económicos del Tercer Mundo that disappeared by the time of Presidente López Portillo, the successor. From 1976, that was finished. And in that sense, it was an interesting experience because by that time, independently that we know, the Mexicans know that how can I say, the reputation of Presidente Echeverría, politically speaking and historically, is not favorable. In the matter of foreign relations, was very active with the African people. I mean, he had contact with very important presidents. He was friend of Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. He opened many embassies compared with that we have now. And it was a very interesting period. But after 1976, the policy changed, and it has been traditionally focused, and all people of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs know it, is very limited, the approach to Africa. We only have 8 embassies. The African representations of Mexico barely surpasses 8 with the pace of the years. And the point is that there's the sensation, obviously, there's economic justifications, economic reasons that say, okay, we don't have a lot of contact with Africa in economic or trade or things like that. Geopolitically, Africa, well, okay, it's not the Middle East. Obviously, economically, it's not like Europe or Asia, that in the past, probably 50 years ago, probably we could say that the marginality of Asia was similar, but now we know that China is one of the main how can I say, partners of Mexico in many fields, like in the world is an important actor. So it changed. I mean, Asia, North America, obviously, Europe, Western Europe are the focus of the or foreign policy. And in the case of Africa, it's very relegated. I mean, even that in the last years, Felipe Calderón went to the inauguration of the World Cup of South Africa to support Mexico, or that Vicente Fox in the 2004 or 6 visited Nigeria. Normally, there's not a lot of interest. Actually, there's academic research of college or centers, Dr. Ila Varela, for example, that she shows that normally the policy is limited. So that's not attractive. For students of political science or international relations, this is not attractive. I mean, you don't have the idea to enter to study that career to be, if the interest or the, how can I say, the presence of Africa is not evident. So that's the problem of the current foreign policy of about Africa, of our country, and is another important reason of the marginality of the African studies in Mexico. Okay. So the third point, the African studies in Mexico and Latin America, I will make some brief comparisons in the pace of this part of the presentation. But okay, first of all, it's necessary to remember it as many times as is necessary. The Eurocentric influence, or Eurocentric thinking. Since we are children, since the primary school, what we learn about of the world is European history or European of our neighbors, obviously Mexican history, but certain areas of the world is very limited information, and the case of Africa is worse, okay? On the other hand, we must remember that specifically the influence of Hegel, the Hegelianism, is important because we must remember that in the case of the Hegel influence, it approached to universities, it approached to intellectuals. I mean, the idea that Africa has nothing to offer culturally or historically is something that even that in the 21st century, with the globalization, with a closer contact with the people of all over the world, of the possibility like now that we can connect with people like Chege that is currently in Nairobi. I mean, in spite of that, there is still the idea that Africa is not an important element for history and culture. It's also necessary to mention something else. Specifically, the Spanish-Portuguese tradition didn't have the experience of creating thinking or ideology like the Pan-Africanism. It's a very strong difference that we have with the Caribbean, with the West and the French, and obviously with the North American experience, with the Afro-Americans, that in the certain moments since the 19th century, they begin to develop a conscience or a reflection of the importance of Africa, that ideology of what that will conform Pan-Africanism, that it will also important for the decolonization of Africa later. This is an experience that in Latin America, we don't have it. Probably Brazil is a difference because with their own process, and probably Mariana will correct me later, that I hope that she'll do if I'm wrong, they have experiences that try to make a mixture, even an identity that probably is also criticized, like the Gilberto Freire, for example. But in that sense, at least there's this important idea that thinking that Africa is part of the Brazilian culture. That's why in the case of Brazil, there's compulsory to study Africa, if I'm not wrong. I mean, in all the universities, you have to study Africa as a compulsory topic in the social science spaces. And it's a very important difference, okay? Because in Mexico, the intellectual history, as we remember, the history of the country, makes the idea that we don't have relation with Africa, that is a very far situation. Another problem, the stereotypes. Why you should study a continent that there's only problem, that is only trouble, that is only chaos? Diseases, how can I say, wars, social problems, civil wars. It's an idea that in certain, and above all, poverty, because at least we know that in the world there are other trouble areas, for example, the Middle East, but there's money, there's oil, there's another context that makes important, and every day we know what is happening there. But in the case of Africa, we don't know the problems in South Sudan. We don't know what happens in Mali. Normally, our national networks, media networks don't cover anything of that. So what is the consequence? That for many students of social science, Africa is not an important topic, okay? So the African studies in Mexico, well, the thing that I want to share with you is this, okay? There's an important moment, actually, Jamie in her presentation, and I think Mariana also mentioned, that is important because in the 50s and in the beginning of the 60s is when we can find more interest, more global world interest in Africa, because it's the time of the Cold War, it's the time of the decolonization, it's the time when the main political and social and economic actors intervene or had a relation with Africa. So it's a moment propitious to study Africa. Not only Africa, the Asian and African studies. In 1964 is the beginning of the Center of Estudios Orientales, that now is the CEA. But up to 1982, due to a very important scholar, Víctor Urquidi, who was president of Colegio de Mexico, it began the program of Africa. It's a story that I plan to talk on Thursday, when we'll talk specifically of the program of CEA. But Mariana already has mentioned some important things. I mean, the idea that you created in the Colegio de Mexico a center that tries to rescue the Latin American point of view of the African studies. That is very important. It's a very different perspective of the Europe or countries that have a history of colonization. It's very important what Mariana mentioned on this regard. But the point is that it's necessary to mention that before the Centro de Estudios de Asia África, la UNAM, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, in the late 50s, with a very famous lecturer, Jesus Contreras Guillaume, began the study of Pan-Africanism and political ideologies and for people of social science, philosophy, international relations of African affairs. And actually, it's the beginning of the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México in the 50s. And in other universities of Mexico, there was developed certain courses about Africa, but something that has already mentioned by my colleagues, more in an anthropological or ethnological approach. I mean, the careers of anthropology could open a course of Africa, but the main topic was not to study African, it was studying the British anthropology school, the French school, the anthropologists, but not African history, not African culture. It was limited to an ethnological approach. But anyway, there was how can I say, the topics, the spaces that were available during many decades. And in that sense, that's the problem that I say, I mean, is that outside el Colegio de Mexico, now in the UNAM, there's a diplomado of African studies, something that I think is very positive and is very important to mention. It's recent. Obviously, it's not, I mean, compared with the years that is working the program masters in Colegio de Mexico is newer, but it's positive to find another space and try to increase the interest of African among people. And it's a positive, how can I say, achievement in my opinion. But the problem is that there's still a narrow space for Africa in social science. For example, many careers of political science and international studies don't have the topic of Africa. Even, I mean, some optative. And when it's optative, sometimes you have to share it with Asian or Middle Eastern topics, something that is reduce the possibility of talking about Africa. And this is a vicious situation. I mean, it's a circle, un círculo vicioso, as we would say in Spanish, that is not positive, because my experience, I have the privilege, I've been gifted of teaching in other universities besides Colegio de Mexico, like Tecnológico Monterrey, like ITAM. And for example, in some schools, fortunately, Tecno Monterrey has the compulsory topic of Africa. The time is optative, but when it's open, it's very positive, the answer of the people. But in other universities or careers of international relations, even it doesn't exist the topic of Africa. Why? Because it's not important, because it doesn't have to do with us, because it's a poor continent. What is the reason? Okay, I think things are changing. Is the new space that we find in la UNAM, in el PUEA, I think it's a positive achievement. On the other hand, in the Latin American context, I know that the presence of the diaspora studies or the local studies about the African relations with the countries, it depends of the country that we're talking about. But it's positive to mention the new, how can I say, the web or idea to create how can I say, a network of people who work African topics in Latin America. This is something recent, some recent. And I think it's very positive. I mean, I think it's a very important step that we are doing, but the struggle is not finished, because we need to struggle day by day with the idea that Mexico or Latin America is a part. Obviously, in countries like, as I mentioned, like Brazil, obviously this idea doesn't exist, in my opinion. But now, in order to finish my participation, something very important that my college has stressed: even we like or not like, even if we want or if not, or if we don't want, or if we wish or not, we are globalizing our world. We will be a very different society. We are being a very different world after COVID-19. So we will need necessary to get contact with the rest of the world to learn of the other regions. I mean, the idea of transregional studies is, I think, is very important and very adequate for this time, because the pandemic shows how dependent of the global world we are in many senses. So I think it's a good opportunity of reflection. And I think, and I hope that this space that we are creating of discussion, it will be useful for the future and for all the people of the many institutions or particular people who are not scholars or who are not in a university, but are interested in the topic of Africa, can reflect about the things that we can do together to give more space for the people who study Africa and who have ideas to learn about the African continent. Thank you very much. Asante sana. Gracias.
Thanks, Arturo. Well, as far as our program is concerned, we've gone through all of the presentations. And if you guys would give me just 1 second, I would like to announce something to the public in general. Los que están viendo la presentación, me han dicho que sus preguntas, si no los pueden mandar al chat, yo creo que a lo mejor no tienen acceso al chat. Lo que están haciendo, Janet Ramírez, que nos están apoyando con esto, está recopilando sus preguntas desde el chat del Facebook, en donde el evento está puesto. Yo creo que la mayoría de ustedes tienen acceso desde ahí. Entonces pueden poner sus preguntas ahí y ella va a ir trasladando las preguntas hacia aquí para que nosotros como los participantes podemos ver las presentaciones. Sorry for that, you guys. If anyone has any other commentaries that they would like to make before we move to the questions, there are a couple of questions in the chat that I believe that you all of you as participants can get in there and see those questions. Some of them are or one of them at least is quite complicated. The second question there, and might merit quite a bit of discussion. But if any of you have any final comments that you would like to make now that you've seen everybody's presentations, I would prefer to give over as much time as possible to the discussion rather than try to summarize what you all have been talking about. But I hand over the floor once again to all of you, or if you want to move directly to the questions and start talking about the questions, that's fine as well.
I can add something very small, Aaron. Thanks. Thank you very much. After listening to the, really, yeah, thank you. very stimulating commentary and discussion, and issues and examination of the state of affairs and the future prospects. But I just wanted to add what has been raised by the importance of SEA, and the role. I think Mariana described it extremely well. That bringing together Africans and Latin Americans and others, because at SEA we met people from, not just the global South, but others, including people and many others who came from this Indian subcontinent and so forth. This center, and I didn't get the full sense of how SEA stands right now, because African studies is, and I surely hope that it is in place. But the point is, if talking about the future of African studies, personally, I am very keen on now furthering these links between Africa and Latin America in a direct way, okay? And that does not exclude, Africanists who are based in the global North or let's say the United States or elsewhere. No, but this comparative is really, really, really important. Someone has mentioned the response to COVID, for example. And I cannot think of a better, for example, collaboration right now. For example, considering the effects of COVID-19 pandemic on political stability, on other social phenomena, a comparative perspective can really, really help relate, what might be happening, in Latin America, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Colombia, elsewhere, and what is happening out here in Africa. There is the purely theory-based reasoning might not always reveal, the nuances that we have been talking about that are often ignored, about Africa. So I think this is compounded by the fact that many European scholars generally have a tendency to compare African real types with European ideal types, okay? All right, this is African democracy. It should be like this, as it was meant. Not being aware, or rather ignoring all the deficits that are involved in Western constructed, systems, including the political systems, the party systems, and so on and so forth. I was rather astounded not too long ago to read in the New York Times an article by a fairly prominent journalist. In fact, I had to Google him up. I don't have the name right now, but just to make sure he was saying things. But basically, this was during the Trump crisis, if you want to call it so, and the standoff of some kind. And he called on the United States, to look to Kenya. Kenya has been having this interesting call for a referendum, and some kind of arrangement between the political parties. It was dubbed Building Bridges Initiative, but more known publicly as the panic. He was saying it is not impossible for the protagonists in the American political drama to borrow a leaf from Kenya, for example, in that kind of, that is a very unusual case where somebody is asking people to look at Africa for guidance. And I think we need a bit more of that. But just to repeat again, I really would look forward to much more, links between ourselves, in particular this group. This is where the things begin, okay? I would really, I'm very, very keen now that I'm located in Africa. I'm very, very keen in further links, including language, of course. I'm actually under some kind of pressure here at Kenyatta University to start Spanish language. And to me, in a little way, it contradicts my ideas about Africa, because I would rather teach Kikuyu and some other Kenyan languages, but there we are. Mexican soap operas, as you know very well, are very, very popular. Not just Mexican ones, but Brazilian ones as well. Is to start this kind of communication and culture, language, culture, music, and so forth. And of course, the other academic disciplines will come in. So that's just me. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, JK. If there are other comments, if there are other comments from other members of the panel, sorry, feel free. Go ahead, Arturo.
Well, I have the opportunity of checking some of the questions of the people who we appreciate that we are getting in touch with them. And I only want to mention two things. Someone asked about if only in the academic space. Let me localize better the question in order of not, how can I say it, change the context. Let me see. That says that, yeah, the question is about that if there are African studies outside the academic institutions. Well, I mean, it's a very rich intellectuality, even in literature, about Africa, from the journalism, from the writers, that has to do with Latin America and Mexico. And unfortunately, in certain sense, and probably it's limited this, we don't have the time as scholars of Africa to mention all these links that are not specifically academic scholarship. For example, María Alicia Puga, she was a Mexican writer of the 70s, 80s, who wrote about a novel about Kenya, about Nairobi, Las Posibilidades del Odio, for example. And it's a very good novel. Actually, it was very recognized by the time. But I see that normally in the Mexican contemporary literature, not all people focus on this. There's also the memoirs of Veronica Volkov, the granddaughter of Leon Trotsky, that talks about the South Africa apartheid. So actually, there's not a monopoly of the topic of African academic. Obviously, we must say that academics is above all a limited space of how can I say, of spreading the information, because it's supposed to specialize. I mean, some of you mentioned that. I mean, besides of being African scholars, we have to have a specialization on Africa. I mean, Mariana works as library in Angola. I work Swahili poetry. All people work specific topics that are more focused in a very narrow audience, that is academic audience. And for the networks and the media, we normally academics don't work very, how can I say it, efficiently. Probably things are changing because of the access of these devices or the platforms of these, how can I say, these spaces. But that's one of the problems, no? I mean, in fact, academics normally, not only for Africa, have a more limited influence in the thinking of people, if they're not connected with the social media, with the media network, no? And there's another comment of David that says that probably the critics to African studies is that they're more focused in traditional topics. I'm not sure about it. I mean, actually many of the investigations or the trend topics of African scholarship has to do with more contemporary items. For example, something that mentions Chege, with the network media, we have access to the music, popular music. There's a lot of scholarship of popular music in many African countries. For example, the hip hop that Aaron and myself, we have worked about it. And there's more contemporary points. It's not only talking about traditional things or ancient things of Africa that limits the situation. The problem are again, the stereotypes, the prejudice that limit the possibility of having direct contact with these topics, I think. And on the other hand, there's not only stereotypes about the tradition and image of Africa, there's the stereotypes of the current Africa. Is something that I mentioned. The idea is that is a poor and chaotic continent, and that obviously doesn't attracts so many attention compared with other areas of the world. Is my opinion about these two questions. Thank you.
Any other comments on the questions? I had a couple of things that I wanted to say, but I'll hold off until everybody's spoken their piece, so to speak.
I was just writing a response.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Maybe I should just say it because I was trying to write a response to somebody who asked about how a person who is interested in the study of this traditional topic, the continent, make a significant contribution through research. And my response is by working in for example, I'll give you an example. My understanding, and I may be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, Mexico conquered malaria way back in the 1970s. So why do we go looking to Germans and others to help us eradicate malaria in Africa? Perhaps we should be looking at Mexicans and or the Americans who have succeeded in that way. So I think there's not because not in Latin America in general, and Mexico in particular, is still very much linked to Western epistemologies. Obviously, there's a lot of including some of the stuff that Jose quoted in Hegelian philosophy as well, in other, Western, German and other philosophies as well. So back to the point, let's work together. I think indirect collaborations, there's another good example I have here of a few years ago, Kenya went to Cuba and brought in quite a good number of doctors, okay? Doctors who, in the usual Cuban arrangement for the doctors, I was amazed, not amazed, rather, I should say, I was very, very happy to see one of the doctors being interviewed in Swahili on national television, working in the rural areas, near Kisumu in Kenya. And, quite content and contributing in a very basic, and a very, kind of collaboration, we need Maria Luisa's book, for example, translated into Swahili, for example, you should come this way so that we can also see and read, or, what Maria Luisa Puza, who, by the way, Arturo, I actually met her personally in Mexico one time. I was very, very pleased. She gave me a copy of that book. I'm sorry, I've lost it. So if you grab a copy somewhere in the, ¿cómo se llama? Esa librería donde compramos ahí en Coyoacán.
Gandhi.
Me consigues una copia de ese
yo te
libro,
consigo.
no existe. Bueno, that's yeah, Gandhi, exactamente. Yeah? Por favor, gracias. Yeah. So yeah, anyway, that's the general point I would like to make on that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks,
That's
JJ.
it. Thank you.
Any other reactions or commentaries? Coco? Perdón, doctor Kakosi.
Bueno, voy a hablar en español. Es que me gustaron mucho sus exposiciones, y hay varias cosas ahí donde podríamos compartir muchas cosas y discutir también. Y Chege primero, Chege nitasema Kiswahili sababu pia ni siku ya Umoja wa Afrika, sio ndio, lakini Aaron atatafsiri sababu kwamba ataweza tafsiri
Sema kama nitaweza kutafsiri Kibembe.
Lakini nimesikia akitaja akisema Kikuyu hapo pia.
Ndio amesema Kikuyu, sio amesema
Wewe
Kikuyu.
Eso utaweza kutusaidia pamoja na Kikuyu bwana.
Sawa. Kwa hivyo nitasema kidogo. Kwa kweli mimi nimevutiwa na kusikia kuhusu Kenya, lakini pia nimepata huzuni kidogo kusikia kuna wanafunzi ambao kulikuwa program ya taaluma tuseme kuhusu Afrika, lakini haikuendelea. Sivyo? Haikuendelea, na kuna wengi ambao hawana ile hamu, nia ya kusoma masomo ya Afrika. Hiyo ni huzuni kubwa, ni huzuni kwetu. Na pengine itaendeleza pia tuseme ukoloni, sababu hatujui sisi wenyewe. Wengine wanasoma kuhusu sisi, lakini sisi wenyewe hatupendi kusoma kuhusu sisi wenyewe. Na nafikiri hiyo ni challenge kubwa tunayo, na inatokana pengine na mambo ya uliosema ya maendeleo, kutafutia maendeleo ya Afrika, sababu wengi wa Afrika watakwambia sasa wewe unataka kufanya utafiti, lakini sasa mimi nitapata ngapi? Mimi nina jamaa mmoja Kongo, niliwahi kumwambia watu tufanye uhusiano, tufanye utafiti fulani. Kwanza akasema mimi zangu ni ngapi? Utanipa ngapi? Unasikia? Yaani kwanza pesa, baadaye mambo mengine. Ndio hiyo kitu cha kwanza nitaka kusema. Sijui kama utatafsiri Aaron au ni sawa?
I mean, ukitaka naweza kutafsiri.
Por favor, Aaron.
Yeah.
No, vile nitafanya naweza kujibu kwa pamoja na kutafsiri pia kidogo. Maanake nikijibu swali lako nitaweza kuambia wengine vile umeuliza, sawa?
Okay, utaongea kwa Kiingereza au kwa Kiswahili?
Español. Bueno, español o inglés. Sí, bueno, sí. Muy buena pregunta, muy buen comentario, buena ndugu Kakozi. Tengo muy poco desde que he vuelto aquí permanentemente en esta ocasión. Y como mencioné, sí, hubo un Institute of African Studies que no duró más de 5 años. Y cuando hablé con la directora, profesora Dungo, Catherine Dungo, me dijo las dos cosas. Primero, no hay financiamiento por parte de la universidad. Entonces, el instituto busque su propio dinero. Segundo, lo más importante el programa más importante que querían llevar a cabo era de lenguas. Los alumnos no suscribieron a ninguna letra. Pusieron anuncios en el periódico. Bueno, yo no estuve, por eso no sé, hay muy poco interés. However, sin embargo, hemos visto el contenido de los cursos en varios departamentos. Ahí sí hay lugar para temas sobre African Studies. Y yo pienso que para esta parte del mundo, hasta antes de que llegue el momento cuando mudamos todos los centros de estudios de África, desde Europa y Norteamérica a África, antes de que llegue ese momento, podemos enriquecer el currículum de las universidades aquí en África, tipo como mostré en el caso de Ghana, ¿sí? Donde sí hay bastante materia. No, la segunda cosa es que para mucha gente aquí, que anecdóticamente, me preguntan, bueno, ¿cómo vamos a hacer Africa Studies? Estamos en África, ¿no? En África, ¿sí? Entonces hay mucha, allá en el norte, en el Global North, estamos hablando de mover el centro de estudios a África. Aquí en África me están preguntando, pero ¿por qué necesitamos un African Studies si estamos en África? Bueno, se necesita un cambio enorme de pensamiento. Pero sobre dos puntos más. Uno es, sí, hay mucho enfoque en el dinero, digamos, ¿no? Remuneración para cualquier cosa que tú hagas. Pero es por necesidad, porque aquí los salarios son muy bajos, los profesores casi los pagan muy mal y a veces no se pagan. Te puedo decir, por ejemplo, desde que yo he vuelto, nos pagan al mínimo al 13 del mes. No puedes recibir tu salario antes del 13. ¿No? Entonces, eso sí causa que los académicos entren a consultancy, ¿sí? Y consultancy es realmente un ayudante, ¿sí? De un académico que está en el norte. Entonces, eso es por necesidad. Now, relacionado a eso, quisiera enfatizar mucha investigación en ciencias sociales y humanas, claro, incluso lingüística, se requiere de muy poco inversión financiera. Yo aquí saliendo de la calle en Nairobi, yo tengo tanto data sobre Sheng, sobre Swahili, sobre Kikuyu, sobre etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, yo estoy tratando de enfatizar a que podemos también todavía hacer buena investigación sin mucho financiamiento. Afortunadamente, desafortunadamente, siempre se pone financiamiento antes de cualquier.
Bueno, gracias. Para Mariana, ¿puedo preguntar algo?
Claro que sí, claro que sí.
Mariana, me gustó muchísimo lo que dijiste y sobre decolonizarnos. ¿Estamos bien? ¿Sí se escucha? Decolonizarnos y evitar como repetir, ¿no? Lo mismo, la forma de cómo se produce el conocimiento sobre África, cómo se investiga, etcétera. Me gustaría si nos pudieras contar tu experiencia siendo blanca del sur global, trabajando en el norte global y investigando, estudiando, dando clases sobre África. ¿Y cómo evitas tú no repetir lo mismo, no repetir el racismo epistémico, el colonialismo dentro de los estudios africanos donde te mueves?
¿Puedo contestar? Bueno, gracias por la pregunta. Sí, yo soy de Brasil y hice la maestría en México, hice mi doctorado en Canadá y trabajo en Estados Unidos hace muchos años. Solo trabajé en Estados Unidos, no he trabajado, bueno, yo trabajé en Brasil en mi vida previa, ¿no? Antes del mundo académico. Pero, sorry, it's in English, ¿no? No in Spanish. Sorry, it's in English or in Spanish? Okay. In Spanish, English.
Whichever makes you feel more comfortable, I think is acceptable.
No, you can use English if you wish.
Okay, although I think that in none of these languages I express myself very well, so it's always a challenge. But thank you for the question. And yeah, so as someone born in Brazil, raised in Brazil, educated in Mexico and in Canada, and working in the US for many years, I am very aware of my position as someone from the global South. I'm very aware of my position as a white Brazilian, but in the US, I'm never seen as a white Brazilian, which also generates a series of problems, personal problems, but also problems in the academic world that I'm always included in conversations about diversity, where I come from. A relatively privileged background, if I consider that I'm in where I come from, very few people have access to higher education, and especially international education, and I had access to that. So one of my struggles in teaching African history, and I think this is my, no, I will speak based on my experience in the US, considering that I never taught African history in other contexts, is one that I find it very puzzling to have a Brazilian woman teaching pre-colonial African history, because this is my area of specialty. And I teach African history before the 20th century. But I do work on Angola, a country that has a long history of colonialism. So one of my concerns, for example, is always not only to center Africans in my approach to teaching and in my scholarship, not only as creators of culture, but creators of political thinking and technology. So I'm very concerned also on how African populations are included in Brazil and in the African diaspora. Is always Africans contribute when they produce culture, but not when they produce intellectual knowledge. So one of the things that I'm committed, and I am very explicit on with my students, is that not only I cite African scholars, but I assign African scholars when I assign African history. So I try also to decenter and decolonize African teaching, that I avoid assigning North American or European scholars who have written extensively and dominate the scholarship. So I'm always including African scholars for my students, and of course, they not necessarily they are aware when they are teaching, but it's something that I always, by the end of the course, I bring to them. And I also think it's important to bring a perspective in the US of someone from the global South. The students do not expect in the university to be taught by a Brazilian immigrant in the US on African history. They expect Brazilians to teach Brazilian history in the same way that they expect Nigerians to teach Nigerian history or literature or whatever. So we are all, people from the global South have to fit into stereotypes in the global North. And what I try to use to my advantage is how I do not fit. And I refuse to conform to expectations that I have to behave in a certain way or that I have to teach in a certain thing. And I have been very actively resisting in engaging in teaching Brazilian history, or the fact that just because I was born in Brazil, I can talk about these issues, because I don't think this is how scholarship or knowledge is created. So my role as I see as my role in North America is to disrupt narratives that scholars from the global South have to act in a certain way or teach in a certain way. And I challenge my students to see Brazilian women, not only of the stereotypes of Brazilian women, of dancing, that we have to be happy people performing in a certain way. But what happens when you see Brazilian women? I tell my students, what if the most important part of me is in my brain, not in my body? How does it challenge also stereotypes about women in general, but Latin American women in particular, who tends to be invisible in conversations about academic knowledge in the global North?
Thanks, Mariana. Coco, ¿tienes otro comentario o pregunta o seguimos con otro?
Después que otros hagan, o tú.
Ok, ¿o quieres que Arturo te responde también? O...
Nísico y África, Guananí, Cueli, Nazarimia, Guasuajili, Wote, Guapo, Ndani, Yamtandao, Kuzikilizam, Kutano, Karibuni Sana. Ya participé en lo de del...
Tengo comentario, pero podría ser después.
Okay, como quieres. I don't know if anyone wants to respond to the other questions that are in the chat. As far as I can see, as far as questions are concerned, we didn't get any new ones in the last couple of minutes. I just had a really quick commentary to make. I mean, it is true that as academics working on Africa, we're also subject to a lot of the same exigencies, if I can say that, as other academics in any other area of expertise in the world. And generally, there's not a award given for activities that fall outside of that view. That is to say, if we make a decision to do something which is not academically recognized, like participate in some sort of an event, or and we're not going to get recognition for that. If I can just give a quick example, when my first book came out here at El Colegio in Spanish, I made a decision to go and present that book at the Centro Cultural José Martí in the center of Mexico City, which is not an academic space. It's a popular cultural space where anybody can enter and interact. The kind of exhibits that they have are, they are painting and other types of cultural manifestations that are not really academic. And the director of that center told me that it was the first time that any academic had ever, as far as she knew, had ever asked to present an academic book at the Centro Cultural José Martí, which is it's not a big space, but they have an auditorium. And when I presented the book with one of our doctoral students, Giselle Arce, we presented the book together, and there was a large turnout. I would say probably over 60 people turned out for the presentation of the book. And the types of reactions that we got were not, the same kind of academic reactions where people are criticizing a factual aspect or things of that nature. It was with people who were generally interested in Africa, who wanted to know more about, for example, Senegal, who someone was asking me, well, what's the relationship between what you do in East Africa and people who speak Wolof? And I explained, well, Wolof is something which is spoken in the western part of Africa, primarily in Senegal and everything else. But there is no institutional impetus for that kind of activity. You have to take that upon yourself. And in terms of those kind of interactions, whether it be with people on the African continent or otherwise, you have to recognize another kind of reward, I would say, other than simply this is going to further my career, right? And that I would say is part of their reality.
Yeah, if I can follow up on that, this is the same struggle that we experience, and I think this is common to anyone, to anyone who has a job in the university. Is always this struggle on producing not only for your peers, but also for the recognition of your work. In the end, we need to keep our jobs, and we need to get our salaries and go through the whole process of tenure, promotion, and so on that exists in different systems. And very similar things happen to me. The fact that I am committed in publishing my work in Spanish and in Portuguese is not recognized in the US as valid. So there is always this struggle that people talk to me like, oh, your first book. And I'm like, no, that is not my first book. I have a book in Spanish that you don't recognize as a valid intellectual creation. But I do have a book in Spanish, and but somehow my career in the US is shaped by the publication of things in English. I only exist as a professor in the US, or someone who is recognized by my publication in English. And this is always the ongoing struggle. And the same is true for people in different systems. And how to overcome that, I don't have a solution, but I think we have to be very creative and make our work available to more people. And scholars are always struggling with this question of how accessible we make our work, and the fact that it cannot be recognized as a valid intellectual creation, and we cannot get points, for our promotions and for our salaries and so on. I don't know. I think we have to keep fighting and occupying spaces, because if we don't occupy these spaces, we also allow the knowledge about Africa to go unfulfilled. And if there is curiosity and people cannot have easy access to our work, we fail as scholars in democratizing knowledge and being in conversations with people who perhaps are more interested in our work than the students who are coming to our undergraduate courses because it's just for a course requirement on the way for their important career paths that they might have.
Any other commentaries or reactions? I'm sort of biting my tongue here. I have quite a few things I would like to say, but I prefer to... Coco, ¿quieres decir algo?
Sí, creo que aprovecho ya como la profesora Jamie ya regresó y porque me gustó lo que, o sea, en todas las tres presentaciones, sobre todo de Arturo, de la profesora Jamie y de Chege, se vio un tema ahí, digamos, transversal de lo global y lo local. O Arturo hablando sobre todo de las conexiones que hubo en los años 60, 70, ¿no? Que ya se olvidó hoy, ¿no? Que esas relaciones intensas que hubo entre África, América Latina, Asia. Y la profesora Jamie en su presentación, digamos, insistió mucho sobre esas conexiones globales, ¿no? O transregionales. Pero Chege habló algo de lo micro, ¿no? Que en estudios africanos, en African Studies, se olvida lo micro, ¿no? Entonces, me gustaría escucharlos cómo, o sea, cómo articular esto, lo micro y lo macro, en estudios africanos. Y a veces lo macro tiende a subsumir o a comer, a desaparecer lo micro. Por eso, digamos, la insistencia de Chege en cuanto a ver lo que está pasando en lo micro, ¿no? En África. Pero al mismo tiempo no hay que olvidar esas conexiones. Pero, y ahí mi pregunta también en mi comentario, ¿cómo hacer? Porque lo global llevó a que se olvidara esas conexiones que había antes entre África y América Latina y Asia. Cuando el mundo se globalizó, después de la caída de Berlín, ya empieza más la globalización, como que esas conexiones se cortan y se olvidan. Y entonces, ¿cómo hacer? Sería como para los tres, no sé si podrías traducir ahí a la profesora Jamie. No
Yeah. I'll translate that for Jamie. Asante, Coco. Jamie, what one of the things that, and actually this is not just for you. I don't want your head to swell here and think that this is
No, I think
only for you. His question, well, it's actually a series of issues. One of the things that all of the presenters touched on in one form or another, but in different ways, is this transversal connection between different spaces, geocultural spaces across the globe and through time. And part of the question is, okay, well, there's this tension which can easily be perceived, especially in African studies, between micro studies and macro studies. That how do you, how do you balance that tension in between the fact that you want to study a specific aspect of a society or societies, but you also want to be able to relate that to what's going on a continental level or a national level or a global level, and how can those tensions be resolved? I imagine you're going to say that transregionalism is the ideal way to do that, because it allows you both to speak about specific contexts and also contextualize them in a larger sphere. But if I understand his question, that the question is primarily for you, partially because you just got back, but also it's for all of the participants to think about that. I was going to say pontificate, but I don't think pontificate is the right word.
I think it's a really critical question, and you all may know one of my colleagues in Tanzanian history, James Giblin, and he wrote a very interesting book called The History of the Excluded, and it was based on the family of his own wife. It was literally a history from the living room. And I've never seen a historian criticized so much as he was criticized for that book, for being too personal and too close to his sources. And I actually found it to be a very profound book because it gave a view that we don't normally get to see, kind of literally out of the living room of the experience of decolonization, well, colonialism and decolonization. Anyway, just to start with that. But it's a question that goes in many directions. And I thought, I understand enough Spanish to grasp your question. I thought a little bit, I've just written an article about Africa and China. And sometimes what happens with the macro, I think Dr. Chege mentioned this too, that it can create an undifferentiated kind of flattening of reality, and it can contribute to reinforcement of stereotypes and othering and so on. And this certainly happens with the Africa-China engagement for many, many reasons, good and bad reasons. But to me, this also has to do with scale. You know, people didn't really think China had an impact when they built a cigarette factory in Zanzibar. They didn't think that a shoe factory in the 1970s was very important. But now the scale of infrastructure as a project, let's say, even my own book was about a railway, people say, well, that's important, you know, that's impactful. But what I tried to argue was that actually the shoe factory, the cigarette factory, the barefoot doctor can have a meaning in its own time that we may not read well in hindsight or retrospectively, having not been there. And for Zanzibar, the vision of a socialist future was absolutely critical. During the Zanzibar revolution, Ali Sultan Isa, one of the revolutionary leaders of Zanzibar, was in Beijing and had to fly home. And this back and forth of the trans-regional connection was part of the construction of the relationship between East Africa and China at the time. So just to say that when we read history through the experience and understanding of the historical actors as best we can gain a viewpoint that we don't isolate from the larger issues of African socialism or Afrofuturism is another topic that I think builds, you know, thinking about transversing huge timescapes. I think we need both, and that's the challenge. And I think it opens up new methodologies that can be really interesting.
Thanks, Jamie. I don't know if other members of the panel would like to respond to Dr. Kakosi's comment or question. Arturo?
Let me put on my turn on. I think it's interesting to mention something now. It's very important, this proposal of the transregional studies that Jamie has talked about and she has worked some years from now. But in fact, the idea of the South-South, I think it has years of having a reality. I mean that those efforts to put together or closer regions like Latin America or Africa in certain academic spaces. But in my opinion, I think it's more complicated. I don't know if my colleagues agree or not, but I think it's a little bit more complicated to put very close the local perceptions with the global perceptions, specifically to audience that they don't have a lot of or identification or information about the other areas. I mean, because for example, remembering a little bit what Aaron was mentioning, that he has a public presentation in not academic spaces but cultural spaces. It's true sometimes, and it depends on who organize. Let me tell you, I mean, it's also depending which organization or place organized this event. But sometimes you found much more people in those spaces than in university. In universities, unfortunately, many times it's empty. But sometimes when you talk about certain topics of Africa, I remember, for example, that some time ago, I was invited to the, I don't know, it was Museo de las Culturas, but it was in downtown. And it was an exhibition about the diary of Che Guevara in Congo. And I was invited to talk a little bit about the topic of the Che Guevara and the experience of the Congo. And it was full. But many people went because of the Che Guevara, no? And were interested that he was in Africa, not all people knew. And there was a lot of interest. And sometimes also cultural items, music, you know, I don't know, music or visual arts or something like this. Sometimes you get much more attraction. The problem is that after the exhibition, after the talk, it disappears. I mean, there's not possibility of continuing a closer contact with the people. But I think it also has to do that with this transformation that probably needs the academic world in the media. I mean, I mean, probably try to follow certain strategies that probably people say, oh, this is only for journalists or for, how can I say, for communication people. I mean, probably we must follow those that path, no, in order to make more contact and to make closer the local with the global, no?
Thanks, Arturo. Any other comments about that question? Okay. Chegues, ¿quieres decir algo? I mean, Vitaka Gungea.
It might be frozen.
I actually cannot see.
Can you hear me? I'm frozen.
Okay,
yeah, never mind. Yeah,
now I can hear you.
I think.
Chege, if you want to, you might want to turn off your video.
My internet connection is very weak. You know,
yeah. Okay. Now we can see you. You might want to turn your video off and just send audio.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead. John, we can't hear you. There's no audio coming either.
Yeah. Turn on your microphone.
No, I think it's on, but the connection is so weak that the audio is not coming through. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I give up.
Oh, shoot.
No, we can hear you, John.
Or could you put it in the chat? It's probably too much to write in the chat.
Yeah, well, I mean, he said basically that he has to sign off in just a few minutes anyway. It's almost 9 p.m. there in Kenya, so in 10 minutes he has to sign off as well. John, did you want to try to make a final comment, or should we move on?
Can you hear me then?
Yes.
Okay, I won't say much because my internet connection is very, very poor. I just wanted to add just to say that, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
How long ago did you hear me?
No, we can hear you in real time. It comes in and out, but we can hear you.
I'm not sure because it's really phrasing. I won't say much. I just want to say
Now we lost you again.
The idea of trans-regional studies is really yeah. Next time.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
Thanks. Thanks, JK.
Yeah.
Asante sana. Okay, any other commentaries? Any now your connection is better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Forget it. I'll save it for the next one.
Okay. Thanks, JK. Okay, any other commentaries? Arturo, ¿quieres decir algo?
You're muted, Arturo.
Yeah, your microphone is still
Sorry,
on.
sorry. No, I want to invite if Jamie or Mariana or Coco, you want to say something else before we leave. A final comment about this? No, I don't know about all this discussion.
I might just say how I'm so sorry, apologize for having to leave for part of the discussion, and just let you know how valuable it is and really important, so many different perspectives. And Mariana offering the possibility that Colmex can be a kind of new center and hub for reimagining African studies. I love that idea. You know, I hope you go for it. And really appreciate it. I've learned so much. I'd love to continue this conversation whenever possible. I've just learned so much. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we were very fortunate, Jamie. Over the course of the past few years, we managed to do 2 new hires in the Africa area. So we're up to 5 professors now, which is it for those of us who were here before. It's very different. At least from my perspective, it's a very different sensation having, I just thought of the word banda in Spanish, which is probably not the right word to use, but having a group of people who are working together on common goals and who support each other is a wonderful feeling. I mean, we went from basically 3 to 5 in the course of just a few months, which may not seem like much, but in terms of an area, it's almost a 50% increase in not just, of course, in terms of the number of people, but also an exponential increase in people's abilities and expertise and everything else. So yeah, hopefully we'll be able to build on that and do a lot of other wonderful things as well.
Yeah, I think it's up to you guys now in El Colegio de México to set the agenda and really occupy the space. I think it's also the moment that, you know, to place African studies and as a scholarship that can be produced in the global South, and place yourselves in the center of the conversation rather than marginalize yourselves, because it's an important center. It has a very important role in Latin America. So go for it. We are all waiting for this new space.
Yeah, I'm coming.
Me too.
It's very exciting. Just the openness to think about these things. It's something you don't see all the time.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Of course, ironically, we did all these great things and then we all had to go and scurry back to our rat holes for a year and a half so far because of coronavirus. So hopefully when all of this is over and we can actually interact face to face again, we'll be able to sort of do a lot more than.
Well,
even what
in my
we've been
case,
able
I
to do.
insist that I insist that this, in certain sense, has been positive. This situation of the pandemic, because it has forced us and enabled us to find ways to continue the academic work. And in spite that I know that specifically, I know American academics is very busy place, because you have to be lecturing with the students and with conference and writing and many things. It's important to find these spaces of connection, no? And actually, in some cases, we have already have this space, but it's important to continue, how can I say, keeping in communication for future projects. And I think it's very positive. And again, I'm very happy that you could join us, and even that it took time to organize this, and we have to find the right time. And even for the people who are connected with us, Professor Nanji, I'm very happy that you're here from New York. Karibu sana wana karibu sana tutangea baadaye wana Abdul. Now, and other people that we know from many years from now, from the ASA congresses and the joint collaborations. I think it's important, no, that we keep on alive this space of the SEA. Mariana talked a lot about it, and we must remember that I remind you that on Thursday it will be specifically the topic of SEA. And actually, how can I say that keeping some ideas and things that I want to talk about the history of SEA for that day. But anyway, I think it has been very positive to be together, to share this time. I'm happy that check already the connection, the internet, mtandao ¿cómo se me poa? I'm very happy that we have the opportunity of talking and how can I say, sharing experience, interchange ideas. And Jamie, Santa Sana Pia, I think to keep in touch with you working in some of the projects, and actually Emily is already with us, and the idea is to keep it stronger, our links, no, with all our institutions and between us, among us. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anyone else? Chege, do you want to say anything now that your internet is up and working? Or
I don't want to start anything. So you know,
okay, well, the audio is still cutting out in any case. So
just for
okay. Okay, well,
yeah, so I'll just say goodbye now. And if you didn't hear what I said before, it was a strong encouragement for us to continue.
Great, thanks, JK. Any other final comments before we say goodbye virtually here until the next time?
Well, en español realmente les recordamos a quien esté conectado todavía que mañana tenemos otra mesa con sobre un tema muy importante que es el del, pues que de hecho varias cosas que mencionaron aquí ustedes son some of the comments that we have mentioned here. Mariana specifically, I remember about the racism and certain attitudes in academic. Jamie as well mentioned something about it. Tomorrow evening we have this round table with people from Brazil. I'm correct, Coco, from Brazil, from an African who works in Asia, and Coco, it will be very interesting. And on Thursday we will talk specifically about SEA, so el programa de África en el SEA. Así que pues las gentes que nos siguen, pues muchas gracias y bueno, pues yo ya me despido, muchas gracias por todo y bueno, si quieres decir algunas final remarks, Aaron.
No, I'm fine. I mean, we're already at 1 o'clock. I think after 3 hours, there's been quite a bit said. Just to thank all of you for participating. This was really a wonderful experience, meeting some of you for the first time, some for the second or third time. And hopefully we will be able to participate together in something in the very near future. Thanks very much to everyone.
Thanks.
Okay, keep in touch.
Ciao.
Kwaherini, tutaonana.
Kwaheri ya kuonana.
Kwaheri, kwaheri.
Daye, Aaron.